It was a sunny Tuesday morning. The courtyard of the historic Telfair residence in Washington was filled with the sound of children's voices. 30 middle school students wearing blue t-shirts were waiting in line in front of the building. They had water bottles in their hands and small backpacks on their backs. They all started walking towards the building at the signal of their teachers. When they entered the door, there was another man walking down the hallway inside. He was in a gray suit, his hand in his pocket, and he was looking carefully at the paintings on the walls. Donald Trump had arrived early for a private meeting with the museum directors, but he thought there weren't many people inside, so he started to wander around the exhibition on his own. Just as he was stepping onto the wooden stairs of the second floor, he noticed children's laughter behind him. He turned around curiously. At that moment, one of his teachers approached Trump in surprise, saying, "Look out, the president is here." Trump raised his hand and smiled. "You're here so early, huh? Am I too early?" The children started looking at Trump in groups. Some squinted their eyes, trying to identify him. A few brave children asked, "Is it really him?" he whispered. Their guide, a short, serious man with glasses, his voice slightly hoarse, had already begun his presentation. "Yes, children, in 1786, when this building was built." But before the sentence was even halfway through, the students had already turned their attention to Trump. Because Trump, while the guide was explaining, was standing right in the middle, raising his hands in the air, looking up at the ceiling of the building and muttering. "This ceiling is high, but it's not as high as the dining room in the White House." Then he turned to the children. "How do you think the man who lived here slept at night? I think he complained about the squeaky floors." The children laughed. The guide paused for a moment. The teacher glanced at Trump, but Trump had already joined the group. Suddenly, one of the students, a black boy, approached Trump and asked, "Mr. President, do you like history?" Trump leaned down and got down to eye level. "Love? I am a man who has lived history, but the most important thing is this. If history makes you feel lived, then you have truly loved it." "That was really cool," the kid said. Trump smiled. "Yeah, I kind of am." Dear viewers, sometimes the most planned trips are made unforgettable by someone who didn't plan them. That day there was a school trip, but that trip didn't just bring an old building to life, it brought an idea to life. Have you ever seen history come to life in a child's eyes? Write in the comments and subscribe. Because this channel doesn't just show what history is, it shows who's telling it. The guide tried to continue his presentation. "And here's a painting." But Trump looked at the painting on the wall and said, "This guy made a fortune selling cotton in the early 1800s, but he didn't know how to build. Let me tell you this, kids, if you're not building, you're just saving." The students nodded. The guide took a step back. From that moment on, the trip became Trump's show. The kids took turns asking him questions. "What was your greatest accomplishment? Have you ever been afraid of anything? Was it hard to be president or to host a TV show?" Trump patiently answered each one. Being president was a responsibility, being a TV star was fun, but kids, don't forget, entertainment also requires responsibility. A female student who said her name was Eliza asked, "Mr. Trump, where do you want to see yourself in history?" Trump was silent for a few seconds. Then he answered slowly, "Somewhere where people continue to talk about my ideas even after I'm gone, but most of all in a line where young people look at me with smiles." Trump continued to explain to the children, leaning on an old desk. The chandelier hanging from the ceiling of the room rotated slowly, occasionally casting its shadow on Trump's face. But the children's eyes were fixed on Trump's words. Because they were no longer listening to history, they were living it. "Now," Trump said, reaching into his pockets, "this house was built in the 18th century, wasn't it? The man who lived here was very rich. But ask yourself this. Is it more important to be rich or to leave a mark?" At that moment, everyone in the room went silent. "You know," he continued, "I have named many buildings after me, but the thing I am most proud of? A young man standing up and saying to me, 'I learned to build because of you.'" One of the students, a red-haired boy with glasses, raised his hand. Do you think anyone can leave a mark? Trump leaned forward. If you are thinking of asking that question, you have already started to leave a mark. The guide had stopped by the wall, his notebook closed. The stage was no longer his, but he couldn't help but smile. Eliza spoke up once more. Would you like to live in history? Trump nodded. Very good question, but I prefer to transform history, because the more important the past is, the more effective the voice that tells it is. The man in this building is now in the grave, but we can touch his chair. What about you? What words of yours will a child write on his wall 100 years from now? Suddenly, something occurred to everyone. It was as if the questions were no longer directed at Trump, but at themselves. Dear viewers, sometimes a history lesson becomes meaningful when it is told standing up, not in books. And sometimes a leadership is recognized not by a title, but in the eyes of a child. Have you ever seen a lesson come true in the eyes of children? Write in the comments and subscribe. Because this channel shows not only what is told, but also how it is told. Trump walked into the other room. There was a wooden alarm clock from the 1800s. Look at this, he said. Time went slower back then, but every tick-tock was the beginning of something. Just like every question you have now is the beginning of your own. One of the children approached Trump and gently took his hand. We never learned this in school, he said. Trump narrowed his eyes. Because school gives you knowledge, but life gives you perspective, and perspective outlives knowledge. Even the teachers who heard these words took out their notebooks, because they knew this wasn't just a trip. This was a moment that lit a spark in a child's world. Trump turned to the children. Now each of you, think of your own story, the one that hasn't been written yet. Even if you don't write your name on a building one day, you too can remain in someone's memory. A message came to his phone at that moment. The meeting for Trump's special tour had already begun, but Trump was still among the students, because at that moment, not the program. The connection was important. The children were gathered around him, some sitting, some standing, listening to their own stories as if they were in the past, and at that moment the guide took off his glasses and approached them. Mr. President, he said, I didn't tell today, but one of the best lessons was taught. History made you live. Trump nodded. Perhaps history is learned not only by telling, but by asking. The children asked, and I gave my answer, but the real answer is written in their eyes. As noon approached, the museum courtyard was quieter. The children were tired, but there was still a sense of energy shining with curiosity on their faces. Teachers were handing out water bottles and trying to gather the children, but no one wanted to leave, because everyone felt like they were just starting to learn everything. Trump was sitting on the stone steps of the building watching the children. He had a pen in his hand. A child had handed him a notebook and said, "Will you write a note?" Trump nodded and wrote a single sentence. "Remember, your story has not yet been written." Then, as he handed the notebook back, he added, "And the best part is, you are the only one who can write it." Hearing this sentence, the children began to come one by one and ask Trump the same question. Some wanted to have it written on the inside of a shoebox, some on the label of a water bottle, some on the cover of his notebook. But Trump said something similar every time. This is not just writing, it is your walk. Writing is easy, but living, this is real history. One of the children, a shy girl who had never asked a question before, finally mustered up the courage. "Mr. President," she said, "I don't talk much, but after listening to you, I wanted to tell you about myself." Trump turned to the girl. "You know, I talk a lot sometimes too, but your few sentences were the thing that stopped me the most today." At that moment, the child smiled slightly and dropped a small origami heart into Trump's jacket pocket. "I made this myself," he said, "because what you said stuck in my heart." Dear viewers, sometimes it's not the big speeches, but the small sentences that resonate the most. No one shouted the history lesson loudly that day, but everyone said it in their minds. Have you ever witnessed a child grow up silently? Write in the comments and subscribe. Because this channel is not just about who told, it's about who heard. One of the teachers, Ms. Lopez, approached Trump. We had nothing planned, but today, for the first time, my students touched history, a history learned not only from books, but also through their eyes. Trump turned to him. Maybe history is not always in the past. Sometimes in a child's eyes, it becomes the future. As the students lined up to board the bus, the guide approached Trump. At first, I couldn't intervene, he said with a slightly embarrassed smile. But then I realized, history is not just what I will tell you. Trump nodded. What you have to tell us is also very valuable, but today we saw how much it can be told through a child's eyes. And then something happened. One of the children came running back. He handed Trump a small notepad. It read, "We learned history on this trip, but from you we learned how to write history one day." Trump folded the note. He put it in his pocket, and he muttered to himself, "No matter how high you look, the moments that leave the most impression are the ones when you are closest to the ground." As the bus moved, all the children put their hands on the windows. Trump was smiling as he waved in front of the stairs, but his eyes were fixed on one point. The first sentence he wrote in that notebook, "Your story has not been written yet." The next day, the school administration gave the students a small assignment. Write down the most important thing you learned on the trip in a paragraph. The answers were different from each other, but they had the same feeling. I raised my hand for the first time. My sentence had history in it. A president spoke to me at eye level. The past is not far from me anymore. I will have a story to tell too. And so, on a trip he only accidentally attended, Donald Trump managed to tell a group of children not about the past, but about the future. Because sometimes the greatest leadership begins not with authority, but with sitting down and explaining at eye level.